how hard we're trying not to speak to humans.
Totally.
We don't want to turn on our cameras during Zoom calls, and we don't want to be in the office, but we're also saying, I'm feeling lonely.
We're measuring based on financial success and growth, but someone's net worth is not their whole worth. If an individual doesn't understand or know their inherent worth, then they are driven usually from more of a sense of self-esteem and external validation versus their inherent sense of worth, where we are in a value revolution. What is the value we or I as a person bring to this world or to individuals or their consumers, or more so, what is the value business brings to the greater needs of humans and society?
Yeah.
I think we need more self-aware leaders. And in order to, build from a place of value, we need to understand our values.
There's so much to rethink. Where do we start and what do we do? Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of She Talks Business. We have a very special guest today. She's former director, community partnerships, product and programs at Meta. Currently, she's working at the intersection of business, leadership development, technology, and social change. She's been featured in 50 plus publications. She's spoken at close to 100 events and doing a lot of amazing stuff. The common theme throughout her career is communities. But there was something that she said during one of our conversations that really stuck with me, which was about there's something that's significantly but very quietly impacting the way that we're building technology, businesses, and communities. So we're going to find out what that is as well, and also dive into the world of building communities. Hi, Grace.
Hi, Sana. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Grace, can you walk me through your journey of building communities and working across ecosystems from, you worked at grassroots levels, you worked with corporate giants. Walk me through how it has led you to where you are today and the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, so community for me has really been the backbone of everything I've done. And, from a very young age, community was essential or really always at the front. I grew up to an Indonesian mother and an Australian father, but we lived in Indonesia. And community is very much in the lifeline of Indonesians. And as I got older, I started to, as a third culture kid, move around, and I really missed a sense of belonging and community. And so I always tried to find communities. And then I ended up moving back to Singapore to set up my first business in end of 2009. And I started to see some gaps, particularly around the entrepreneurship community, the creative community. And that's how I initially started to build my own communities. So, back in those days in Singapore, Singapore was trying to push creative entrepreneurships or the creative industries. And so one of the first communities we brought in was actually, or I brought in with two other partners, Dalen and Renyang, was actually Creative Mornings. And Creative Mornings at that time was not in Asia. And it was connected to hundreds of cities around the world. And my goal and intention was to amplify and elevate the region and showcase the region, starting with Singapore, for the diversity that it has and the talent, right? And so that's how I initially started with my first foray. And actually, at the same time, I was doing TEDx. I worked with Dave Lim, who's the guy who had the license for TEDx Singapore, and we launched the first ever TEDx Singapore Women. So for me, it was just like a natural thing. I love people. I love connecting people, although I'm an ambivert, and after that, I started to see a bit more of a gap in the entrepreneurial space, but specifically to women. And as a woman running my own business at that time, I felt like I was alone because everyone was following down the traditional corporate rat race. And I was there setting up my first business. And so it wasn't in tech, but I was working with brands and businesses coming into the region, doing PR and marketing. And actually a lot of that stuff was around organic marketing. And starting with connecting to communities and creating partnerships and word of mouth and seeing that cult following and those movements sort of happen. So that's then when I launched with two other girls, Secret Women's Business. So that's kind of how I started creating those. And Secret Women's grew to 6 cities. So Singapore, Bali, Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila. And, after a while it had its lifetime, and I feel like there's a time and a place for things to rest. And then I continued, in different forays or ways, and engaging as well with communities. And then in 2018, I joined Meta as the director of community partnerships. And we worked with programs and products, really trying to shape product strategy, and work with some of the largest and most engaged communities on and off platform. And really trying to find ways to build sustainable communities. Not sustainable necessarily in the green sense, but that was, probably not something I would ever think I would do. But it was almost like a role match made in heaven. So I oversaw APAC and then interim EMEA. And since then, I've been doing a little bit more fractional work, working on community-led strategies for growth, specifically with startups and scale-ups, and thinking about how we bring community as the core of a business for driving growth.
Awesome. That sounds like a lot.
Yes.
A lot of amazing stuff. But having been in the field of, or in the space of building communities and helping brands build communities, how do you feel about the current landscape of community, where we're talking so much about community on the one hand, like it feels like everybody's trying to build a community, but at the same time we're also seeing a lot of isolation and loneliness, and there's this imbalance. So my first question is, how do you feel about community becoming this almost like a buzzword today?
Yeah. I mean, buzzword it is. I feel like everyone and their mom wants a community, to create a community, right? Not wants one, but to create one particularly. To be honest, sometimes I feel like distancing myself from the name or the title community because I was pigeonholed in it. But as an avid generalist, or multi-hyphenate, I don't see myself in one box, but I think community is what brings everything together. So I struggle with the word being overused. I think we know we want community and we need community as a society, but like you said, we are more disconnected than ever. And this, point around isolation is extremely important for us to think about, and how community plays in that, both on the digital side or online communities, but also in real life. I feel like community has become overused and underappreciated, and also because it is easy to start a community, but it's really hard to maintain and engage and create the right experience, right? At the end of the day, I see community as, how do you create amazing experiences to address human needs, right?
Yeah, and that sense of belonging.
Yes,
right?
exactly. And so I think it's great that we have that buzzword, but I think we need to think about, what does community actually mean when you're a brand? Why are you building it?
Yeah.
What are the core reasons and drivers for building that community? And is it just a marketing play, which for some businesses it is, but some people think a newsletter is a community, which is actually just one part of the bigger piece of a community, right? So I think it's really trying to maybe educate or re-educate brands and organizations around, where does this sit in your business, and how core is it? Because otherwise it becomes a nice to have versus a need to have.
Right. What do you think we're really doing wrong when it comes to building communities?
I mean, look, I don't know if we're going wrong. I would say maybe that's not the right word. I think we're over indexing on trying to build communities because we are struggling to build trust and authentic relationships with our users, right? Let's say what brands would say, or our customers, versus I look at it as, again, community is something humans need, right? And so how do we focus on what is that need that we're addressing to create the right experience, but then from there it will be building trust, right? Because you can't just launch a community and expect overnight you're going to have a certain level of engagement. And many brands do it. And again, taking this from a brands and organizational level, or even for startups, they do it because they know it's going to drive, some level of growth. But then it can be very short-lived because the resourcing and the time and being able to connect and create meaningful relationships and, a dialogue takes time. And that is not something sometimes that brands want to do. So I think we're having the wrong drivers. So growth metrics that, don't necessarily think about impact, and looking at community as an alternative marketing mechanism because maybe they're not getting what they want in other forms of marketing.
Yeah, but do you see that also becoming a problem with community now? Because starting, like you said, launching a community is just easy. Anybody can launch a community. There can be we see all these WhatsApp groups and Slacks and
Yes.
all of that. What do you see as the future of community? Do you think that we're going to live with these shallow WhatsApp groups and Slacks, which are short-lived, or is there a better way?
I think there's always going to be a group for someone, right? Or a community for someone. There's always going to be a niche or niche, depending on how you say it. And, I do see more community platforms like Heartbeat or Circles or these other types of platforms. I think the challenge then becomes they're all very separate, right? And so you have people in different containers or community spaces if it's online. I think the other is that people are going to start wanting more micro communities because I think the challenge is, from my perspective, once a community has grown to a certain level, you miss that scalable or you miss that intimacy.
Yeah.
Right. So I always think about it and go, how do you build scalable intimacy? Right. What are those experiences? And AI can help with some of that in regards to connecting and matching, but you still need a human touch. Right.
Yeah.
And then you think about offline and online connection. So, I think people with this current changing landscape of value and what we value in society right now because of AI, right? I think people are going to want more offline experiences. And people are going to want to have more of that in-person connection and then be able to bring them online. So I think those, I would say, are the two things I see as the micro communities and then the, offline experiences, but further sustained through online engagements because we kind of want that as well when we're not together in person.
Yeah. You mentioned value, and it brings me back to what I said right at the beginning about something you said during our conversation which stuck, which is that our sense of value and our own self-worth and how we measure value is significantly impacting the way that we're building communities and businesses, technology, all of that. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I see us as a world kind of going through two revolutions at the same time. And, one is that we are in a value revolution. So understanding, to your point, around what is the value we or I as a person bring to this world and in a job, especially with AI. Again, buzzword for the year or whatever. And two is what is the value businesses bring, right, to us or to individuals or their consumers and more so, what is the value business brings to the greater needs of humans, right, and society.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I see the value revolution, which I'll touch on again, maybe if it's not answering your question. The second, I think, is in parallel, this worth revolution, which I find right now is something I'm exploring further because they interconnect, right? So to me, I find it if an individual doesn't understand or know their inherent worth, then they are driven usually from more of a sense of self-esteem and external validation versus their inherent sense of worth, right? So I think we're questioning both, who we are as people and what society needs and what businesses can create in order to support where the world is going.
But what you're saying is, I mean, there's a way that we measure value today as businesses and
Yeah.
as well as on a personal level. And what you're really saying is that we need to change how we measure it or what we measure. Is
Yeah,
that
I think it's a bit of both. Like, I feel like it starts with we do need to shift our traditional success metrics,
right?
right? And I think that's be it as an individual or as an organization, right? And then I think even from a community perspective, I think we need to value communities more. So let's say from a community perspective, many people think communities should be free, right? And that community leaders shouldn't monetize. I've been there. I've had a lot of free communities, and I've also had some where when we did want to start monetizing, and this was, 2010, 2011, became a real issue because people were like, you're a community, right? And many people think that in the past, before community became a buzzword in these few years, right, or even before Meta, people would think that as a community leader, you can't make money, right? So, but actually, if you look at the value of community now, there are communities that are like you pay for.
Yeah,
and there have been in many ways. They were maybe just called memberships or associations,
or
just
clubs.
a club,
Yeah.
right? But they're still a community. So I think in that perspective, I feel like, we need to value what communities are, both from a financial perspective and from the impact perspective that it brings. And then I think from a business perspective, or I probably take it from a leadership perspective, right? Which ties into the individual side, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we need more self-aware leaders. And in order to, build from a place of value, we need to understand our values.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we don't have enough self-leadership and self-awareness, which in turn means that we're designing our organizations, based on traditional success metrics, such as, I'm going to raise X amount because I'm going to make X amount, or the hope is, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm going to get recognition and validation and status,
Yeah.
or I'm going to be wealthy from a financial perspective, right?
Yeah.
Versus, like, to me, I think those should not be the drivers, but instead we should be thinking about how does this product or how does this service create impact based on a core need of who the people are we're serving, right? And so that I hope that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah. But I think, and I mean, I struggle with it.
Yeah.
We live in a world where that's what matters, right?
Yeah.
To most people, that's what would give you, and again, it ties back into, we need that external validation of, when I go and introduce myself, what do I say? What value am I creating? And impact might sound a little soft that way. So what's the alternative world? Like, how do you balance, okay, yes, I want to measure my worth with the impact that I'm creating and the lives that I'm changing. But then there's that conflict of making money, and I still need to make money. And then that's how others will probably value my work, and so on and so forth. So there's this tension between those two things, as much as I'd love to like bring them together. And this might turn into like a therapy session. I don't know. but but it's something that I've been very consciously trying. It's why I moved to Bali, because I wanted to slow down and like rethink what mattered and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But it's not easy.
Yeah, and look, I don't think it's going to change very quickly, right? But I do think that it needs to start just by awareness, which is talking about it like we are now, right? Because every big change starts with people talking about it.
Yeah.
And we're going through where people have been laid off, right? Companies are restructuring. There is, demotivated employees, people questioning what does a future-proof career look like, right? And actually, this is something that, from building the Change School, which was one of my businesses in the past, we started to see that people would only make these changes or have these questions around who am I, what are my values, when there was a pivotal moment, like a death, a divorce, a financial issue, a health issue, being laid off, right? When I think what I'm trying to do right now with this whole conversation around, say, worth and value is help people get to that earlier before a pivotal moment, right? And, on the financial, that's where I see things as interconnected. So to me, I look at it as we need to shift systems. So we need to shift even like financial systems. Right now, there's a term called financial activism, which is really around, thinking about what are the systems we've created and how do we change that for minorities, for women, for different cultures, et cetera. The systems we've built aren't working, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this is part of this revolution that we're going through, whether it's the value revolution or, what I think is like a worth revolution. So for me, like how I do it myself is that I'm very strong in saying that these are businesses that I don't want to align with. And I know my worth and my value, and I'm going to stand up for certain things,
Right.
and I'm going to, speak up about certain things too. And, whether that's about how much you want to charge for yourself, and if people don't want to pay that, okay, move on. Understand that obviously, there may be some financial constraints for some
Yeah.
people, but it's not being shifted in your decisions or other things because of external validation, right? And I think that's what, unfortunately, sometimes leaders do. Their value is based on ego
Yeah.
and self-esteem. And how a leader leads with self-esteem is very different to how a leader would lead with self-worth.
Can you elaborate that a little bit?
Yeah. So actually, I've been diving into this whole space of self-worth, and someone that's been really supporting had wrote a book called The Self-Worth Safari. So if someone wants to read it, definitely like highlight it. And I've recently been working with them in different ways. And, one of the things is that self-esteem goes up and down. And this is in the book, and I'm probably not giving it justice, but self-esteem goes up and down depending on how good you feel. Right. But self-worth should be stable, and like your inherent worth is
Right.
core and foundational and shouldn't be impacted by your external, right? So an internal validation, your own validation, and owning your story and owning you and loving and self-compassion, all of these things, to then going, actually, I'm not worthy because I'm, someone else is saying I'm not worthy, right? Or I didn't do a good job there because my manager yelled at me, or, I didn't get the promotion, so therefore I'm not good, right? But if, so I think that's where self-esteem feeds us when it's good, but makes us depressed when
Yeah.
it's not. And that can change depending on who talks to you, how it impacts you, and then of course how you lead, right? If people love you, then great. But if they don't, right, and politics comes into play in an organization, then your mind might go spiraling down.
Yeah. How does one build self-worth? Where do I start, for instance?
That's a great question. I mean, for me, I started, and when we did the change school, it was always looking at understanding your values, right? And really going, what are my core values? And actually, I was just having this conversation with someone recently who is trying to figure out their next steps. And, it's interesting how we're not taught to know about values. We're not educated. So I think this is a gap right now in our, society where people don't even know what values are. Like, sometimes you could give them a cheat sheet, and then it's still really hard to choose them and know innately what it is. So I would say, some of the practices we've done in the past is try and get a cheat sheet of values, circle, 5 to 10 of them initially. You could circle more, but try and, circle 5 to 10 and then define them for you. What does it mean? So if you're saying, autonomy, right? What does autonomy mean to you?
Yeah.
Right? Because it can mean very different things to you.
Yeah.
Right? Or, grit. or curiosity, right? Or wonder, whatever these, could be, really write and define them. That's a good starting point.
And I think I also read something, I think, on your LinkedIn about, how, just like you said, how you measure impact and what your values are and so on, but also how you measure wealth.
Yeah.
And so, could there be different ways of measuring wealth if we're so tied to measuring our worth?
On external financial
Yeah,
metrics.
absolutely.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the reason I got into this financial well-being and seeing now trying to connect wealth and worth is from, again, my own journey. I always feel like I'm scratching my own itch, and then I see something there, and because I've gone through it and I've seen the other things. So I only recently got certified, well, a couple of years ago, around financial social well-being and trauma-informed financial facilitator, et cetera. But there is a connection around wealth, right? And what metrics we should be recreating for wealth. Because traditional credit systems were made by white men, right? And we now are living in a place where we have diverse populations. And so should we rethink how credit systems are made, or should we not have credit systems, right? Yeah. Again, looking at how finance has changed with regards to decentralization and Bitcoin and all these things, which again, I don't want to really dive into that because it's a whole other thing, but we should be creating these new systems for financial well-being for more than just white men, right? And more than just for white women, like for minority populations and for growing Asian population as well, right? But oftentimes we still see we're measuring based on financial success and growth, but someone's net worth is not their whole worth, right? And so I look at it as, what are your dimensions of wealth? Like spiritual wealth, physical wealth, relationship wealth. I think there's other parts that we should be, questioning.
So if we were to rethink business from that perspective, and I know it's a loaded question, right? Because there's no easy answer, I would assume. But how do we rethink? Like, there's so much to rethink. Where do we start?
If we can rethink how we are, like this is why it keeps coming back into this. It's sort of an infinity or a loop, right? Like if we as leaders don't have our sense of self-worth and self-awareness, right, then we are always leading from ego, from wanting external validation, all of these sort of things, and building the wrong products, right? Really, we don't have the right metrics for all of this stuff right now, right? And so that is the problem that we need to change. We need to start looking at it from, diverse lens, from really thinking about the products that we're building, not just being about growth and redefining what growth means, really. We need to be redefining everything and questioning everything that has been the narrative for forever.
Yeah, but it's an uncomfortable space, right? Because I feel like I'm in that place where I'm rethinking a lot of that, but I don't have the answers. So it's like, yes, I'm not comfortable with what is, but I also don't know what should be. And there's this gap and there's this gray area where I'm living my life today, where I'm trying to do what I want to do and what I tie my worth to, but there's also, when I'm speaking to someone else, it still doesn't feel good enough.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I think we're at this place too, to your point, and I feel like I said this in prior interviews, like even maybe 10 years ago, but we're like tectonic plates. The time we're in right now are like tectonic plates trying to find where to go, right? Because there is so much movement. And I feel like it's okay to be in this space. That's the exciting part. Maybe I'm too much of an optimist, right? But in every gap, there's an opportunity.
Absolutely.
And sometimes we can't connect the dots, right, straight away. And so how I do it is usually through a process of elimination. And I just try and I test and, sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. But then I validate it through either, conversations, or like right now, this whole conversation around worth, it can seem very intangible.
Yeah.
Right. But if, this self-worth safari book, they do talk about how he's surveyed many individuals. And one of the things was that self-worth, so people who have self-worth are more resilient, are less likely to burn out, and also are more adaptable. Right. And so, that is proof. There is proof. There's not enough work right now in this whole space. But there are ways to prove that. And I think depending on where you want to play in this world as an individual or as a founder, you can either build what you want for the future in order to create the right change, or again, right, maybe not the word, but the change that we need.
Yeah.
Very Gandhi there, but no, but so you create it, right? Or you just follow the rest of the herd.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe people like you, are driving the change. And so sometimes it can feel uncomfortable because, I know it does sometimes because I'm like, am I the only one thinking of this stuff? But then there are clusters or communities of folks who are, right? And I think when you're an entrepreneur, it's really, really easy to like beat yourself up because we are driven by external validation. And that goes back to know who you are, own your story. And, how many entrepreneurial stories have we heard where, I don't know, like the Airbnb guy, right? Like, he went to X number of investors and they said no.
Yeah.
This story happens all the time. Yeah. But again, I feel like we've celebritized entrepreneurship and, it doesn't always turn out. And founders have huge mental health, right? The statistics around mental health and burnout. And I think you wrote some posts on LinkedIn about this, not long ago. And why are they burning out? Like, why should we even be burning out as people? Because we're driving and hustling based on a society that tells us that that's right.
Yeah. Do you think this entire, the change that we're going through, but also the disconnect that we have from ourselves and how we're valuing or how we see value creation, etc. Do you think that's reflecting in the products that we're creating and the solutions that we're building?
I see some for sure. I definitely see some products, like even just more sustainable products, right? We're creating more conscious. We're more conscious about how we create products, how we consume the food we consume. So I think there are some. I think there needs to be more so maybe in the tech space, right? Because I think that landscape is also going through its own evolution, right? From social media platforms. Look at, Blue Sky, right? So I think we are. I think it's just a matter of time, right? Again, maybe it's my hopeful, optimistic side, but I think we need to talk about the problems more and educate leaders on, how they can self-lead. But I do wish there were more products that were actually more useful for versus just another app.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think it goes back to the metrics that we're focusing on and the need to reevaluate those.
Yeah, and I think with AI, it's so moving so fast that it's almost like what will it do and what can it not do? So I think we're going to need to think about more of the human experiences and how that works on top of it all.
Do you think, one of the things that I keep seeing is how hard we're trying to automate and delegate and all of that, but also craving that connection, how hard we're trying not to speak to humans, right?
Yeah, totally.
And yet we want to speak to humans.
Totally.
We don't want to turn on our cameras during Zoom calls, and we don't want to be in the office, but we're also saying, I'm feeling lonely. Do you think we've come to a point where we'll be like, we've had enough and we want to go back to, in-person communication and speaking to more humans? I mean, for me, 2025 is definitely the year that I speak to more humans.
I mean, yeah, I feel like 2025, I probably may not speak to as many humans. No. But I think that's a really good question. I mean, I for sure do feel deep down that human connection is, in person is never going to go away. Right. I think the thing is, though, when you're seeing people online, it's very different.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the same level of connection, but I think it can, depending on how you facilitate, right? Depending how you hold space, and in a meeting, it's not always the most, it's not always usually held very well, let's say, right? Sometimes you don't need to have those meetings. And
but that was true in person too.
Totally. But at least in person, you can hey, how you doing? Have a little side chat. You can't really have a side chat on Zoom unless you're typing.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have the same vibe.
Yeah. But that's exactly what I'm saying, right? We're trying so hard to not meet in person. I think there's so much to rethink. Which is what's uncomfortable, right? So for instance, I see the merit in online work and I see the merit in remote work, and like our team is entirely remote and we've been remote for the longest time, even before COVID and so on. But I also see real value in being, meeting in person and the kind of collaboration or creativity, and maybe one day we'll find the same kind of energy online. But I have my doubts.
Yeah, I know. I feel you there. And sometimes I like not feeling like I have to be somewhere, though.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, that's where I go back to, hang on, my personality style is an ambivert. So when I want the energy to be by others, I will go find it. And when I don't, I will not respond to your message for a week, But yeah, I don't know. I think that's the challenge. I feel like we need to think about what agility looks like in the workforce, right? Moving forward. Like you said, hybrid, remote, because I miss working with teams and people in person,
absolutely.
and having those side conversations. Because it's not like a one side. This is the thing, actually. I don't know if, but to me, I look at it as like, we've been taught how to think. Right? We've been taught what to think, not how to think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And this is the thing, because sometimes I'm like that with certain things. I'm like, I just want to know the exact steps. Right? But actually, and I have this with my child, one of my kids right now. I'm like, I want to teach her how to think, but I'm like, can you just do these steps? This is how you do it. Right?
Yeah,
and like we all try and follow rule books and playbooks. And I am anti-rule books and playbooks to an extent. And the way that I do things is that I look at all these different rule books and playbooks and I choose the pieces that I like. And that is actually part of my human design. Like as a manifesting generator, we don't follow the rules and we like to pick from different things.
Yeah, I think one of my pet peeves is the this versus that debate where we feel like we either have to be this or that. So it's whether it's men versus women or it's remote versus in office or whatever it is, we feel like we have to make a choice when, but when you're dealing with humans, it's not black and white.
It's not as binary.
There's a lot of gray. There's so much nuance. Everybody's different. Different things can work for different people, and that's okay. But we want to know, you'll have all this conversation and somebody will be like, yeah, but is in person better or
totally. Or they'll be like, like I always look at a wheel of life, right? And at different stages that wheel can change, right? Like, so maybe right now you want to spend, you'll spend say 40% with friends and maybe, 30% with family and 20% on yourself, right? And however you slice that pie. But later on, that pie could be very different.
Absolutely.
And someone else in the same age, at the same, level of, life, right, might split it very, very differently. Right? It's the same thing as learning styles. We all learn and consume information differently. Right? And I think that this is the challenge. We are still looking outside for a lot of the answers.
Yeah.
When inside we have the answers, we just need to learn to listen again. And I'm not saying I do it perfectly, right? Like it happens to go up and down still.
Yeah, yeah. And that would also feed into how when brands are thinking about community, they need to keep in mind how everybody's different and they're in different stages. Like you said, we consume content differently, we
Yeah.
learn differently, so that one size fits all and that scaling wide conversation where we want to scale everything to sort of like generalize stuff and so on and so forth is not that easy when it comes to communities.
Yeah, 100%, because behavioral, right? And cultural. And this is something we noticed at Meta too, right? Is like how, an Indonesian community is to an Australian community, or if you put Indonesians with Australians and other Western community members, there might be more of the, Western voices showing up, right? Because let's just use Indonesian as a culture because I'm half Indonesian and I can speak to it. They're less likely to speak up, right? And that's in a digital setting, let alone in a physical setting, right? So those things, when you're saying like brands are like, okay, we're going to scale everywhere, you need to be locally attuned and globally attuned,
Absolutely.
right? And I think this is the problem sometimes with brands looking to scale, or companies, is we are not attuned. We are not attuned to the behaviors and the nuances of the local markets and needs, and how they engage with one another is also very different, right? One-to-one, one to a small group, one to many. And the type of content, like we would see that sometimes content for certain markets didn't work because also they're on a different device, right? So 2G versus 5G, right? And some preferred audio versus like no one's going to look at slides, so even that. And I think in this space around like movements, or, these shifts we're having, one other thing around community that I think would be nice to highlight is we need to accelerate the industry around community professionals, because it is not something that is valued enough or recognized, right? In the same sense where it's like, as a community builder, in the past, you probably wouldn't have gone paid, but now everyone wants to hire you because they want you to build your event. And they start with an event first, right?
And it's usually one event and they're like,
yeah, exactly, right?
Didn't work.
Exactly.
Where's the community?
Exactly, right? They're like, but I had like 200 people. Why aren't they wanting to come onto my app? And you're like, well, there's a bit of a, gap there. And this has been one of my frustrations, is working with some companies where they want accelerated results to get community members in their community without actually thinking through, again, why am I building this community? Should I actually build a community, or should I partner with existing communities? Right? Because I think that's a thing we don't think about as organizations too. Maybe we don't need to create a new community. Maybe we could partner with existing communities, right? Maybe we don't have the resources right now to build and actually sustain the right type of experience and engagement. So I don't think we need to be building communities left, right, and center, right? Unless there is a real need. So that then goes to, the community professions. Right now, I think they're undervalued because community is undervalued from a business perspective. I think, especially in this part of the world. I think in the US and Europe, they're a bit further ahead. You have companies like OpenAI, I saw, has like had their first community lead. Obviously companies like Notion, Framer, Salesforce being like the OG in B2B communities. But again, I feel like the industry needs more acceleration and capacity building, right? Because many community managers or community leaders who are in some of these roles started as a social media manager. And I think they're two different things, because or an events person, right? And, both you and I being community leaders in different ways, having built our own communities, it's actually a mix of all of those, right?
Absolutely.
And it's like you need to have that human connection. You need to want to connect with people and engage with them, hear them out, listen to what they want, or not just what they want, but like just hear them out, right? Make space for them to also have their own dialogues with each other
Yeah.
and really create magical, serendipitous moments, right? And connect in different ways. But social media manager versus, I'm not, discounting that they can't.
But it's just different things.
Yes, I think there's a big gap
Yeah.
of like education and capacity building.
Yeah.
And that's places where like the community club, which yes, I am sitting on their board, but they actually are looking at accelerating the professional industry. And when I was at Meta, we launched the first ever community management certification in really trying to, build some level of capacity of community leaders.
Do you think the reason that community isn't valued enough in our part of the world, particularly, is that, I mean, we all know that people want community. We can
Yeah.
see it when we speak to people. We can see that where there's this, need for connection and so on and so forth. And so it's probably the reason why businesses are at least thinking about it or talking about it. Whether they're doing it right or wrong is a separate question. But do you think it's because we haven't been able to build a business case for community? Like, it's not very easy to show the ROI of a community, or maybe we haven't done those, had those initiatives long enough to show impact, because like you said, community is not a short-term thing. It takes a while for it to show results.
Yeah, I think it's maybe a bit of both. Like, do organizations stick through long enough, to get that impact that they're looking for? But also at the same time, I think organizations sometimes just do want it to go to revenue, which I get. But, community takes time and trust. And that's why, we need to nurture and foster them. And if you're not willing to do that, then that's, I think, a different thing. But I do see communities in like that are really successful from an ROI perspective, or, more, I guess, easily measurable around like customer success communities, right? Advocacy or ambassador programs.
Right.
But again, they're not called communities, right? Like, they should be. But advocacy programs, ambassador programs, memberships and associations, those sort of things that I would still consider in the wider term community do have measurable impact. A lot of B2B SaaS platforms do use community in their customer success, right? But also for their partner like, I wouldn't say partner management, but like usually a lot of companies have partners, right? And so really they build a community of their partners. So I do see that, but I think when it comes down to a brand and their customers, that's still questionable to what ROI is. But I know people in the wider space of the community field who are way, way more deeper into this are really looking at it.
So community as a product itself, and then communities around a product or service or brand. Are there any differences that stand out in how they're built, how they're launched, how they're sustained,
So
or how they create value?
So can I just clarify, I guess, community as a product being like, if you're, let's say, a mom's community and you have a subscription model or a membership model.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then from the other end,
is what the Notion community
or
is,
like
right?
Peloton.
It's around, it's around a product. It's not the product itself.
Yeah, I think, from my experience, but also, from seeing so many during the time at Meta, we were working with a lot of community leaders, and those where community is the product, and not, not everyone was monetizing their communities, right? And if so, maybe they were monetizing it not just from a gated community perspective, but from like referrals or sponsorship, partnerships, in those sort of ways, right? And the difference between a community as a product, if we're going to use that term, is that it started with a community leader, right? And it was born most often by a desire, like of a passion or purpose or seeing a need, right? And that's how the community formed, and it grew very organically majority of the time, right? Whereas community around a product, right? If it's a brand orientated product, or like New York Times had publishers in their communities, and a group, or again, the Nike Run Club, these sort of things, right? I think they're different depending on what the product is, but yes, they're not led by a leader, right? So they have to be thought about. They're started differently for sure, because they're started for different reasons at the end of the day, even though it still provides a sense of belonging. And so it's not the founder of the community that is, igniting and engaging initially. It's a community manager, most likely. It's very different. I do think so.
Thank you so much, Grace, for your time. And for the very interesting conversation. I see a lot of overlap, so I think we should meet more often.
100%. I mean, I'm all for more conversations, but thank you for having me as well.
Thank you.